Hi, I'm Thilo, and this is Thilo's Theology Service. Hi, I'm Thilo, and welcome to the shop. Today we will be talking again with my friend Daniel Hanna, who you might remember we discussed how to approach texts on a previous video, and this time we're going to address we're going into possibly a multi-part discussion on Saint Athanasius on the Incarnation. And so to begin, for those who aren't familiar with my friend Daniel, I'm going to ask him to give a little bit about his background, and then we're going to jump into some context for the text. Daniel?
My background as it applies to what we're going to talk about, my degree's in history, and when I studied undergrad, I focused on the late Roman Empire, the time period where Christianity arose and the church fathers wrote. Then I did credentials in history and English, but I've taught English for my entire career as a teacher. So the past 5 years, I've taught nothing but reading to students.
Great. And when we talked about approaching this text, which let's, as we enter into this, let's just start with the concept that the people with whom we're speaking are a blank slate. They've never even heard of it on the Incarnation. And we'll kind of start there. For me, this was huge as a convert to encounter this text, and really the foundational nature of this text in Orthodox soteriology. As we know, Western soteriology kind of has this juridical model where God needs to punish somebody to satisfy his wrath and his justice. And so enter Jesus, God punishes him instead of punishing everybody else. And then those who aren't found in Christ get that punishment that he laid on them, that he laid on Jesus, laid on us. And in the Orthodox concept, it's all very different. So as I understand from you, because I haven't read the other text that we're going to be discussing, there's a background to On the Incarnation. And so I'd like you to kind of introduce Saint Athanasius, who he was, and then the background text that actually precedes the text that we're going to approach and why that's important to understand.
So Athanasius, for those who are not familiar, was an Egyptian church father who wrote in Greek because he was from Alexandria. And he combated the Arian heresy. So the idea that the Son of God is not God himself, but something like God, that was the Arian heresy. Athanasius wrote against them because from the very beginning, the Christian church had believed that the Son of God was co-eternal, co-essential with the Father. So this is what he's mostly known for. But the reason that he's so celebrated among the Greek-speaking churches, and even you go to any other Orthodox, they hold him as the standard of orthodoxy. They have a title for him, the canon of orthodoxy. Canon here means measuring stick or a reed. He's the measure by which we determine the orthodoxy of other fathers. Now that's very nice and poetic, but this is not quite how we determine the correctness of a father in the church. We look at their agreement on dogma, and where they agree as a whole, that's orthodoxy. Where they disagree, this is not dogma. So St. Athanasius is celebrated because when you compare him to all the other fathers on doctrine and dogma, he's very clear, he's straight to the point, he's a great explainer, and he develops systemic reasoning, systemic thought. So the two works that we're looking at today, and notice I said two. People are saying, wait a second, he introduced On the Incarnation. That's right. But On the Incarnation, when it circulated in the ancient world, especially among the Latin speakers, in Latin translation, it was the second part of a two-part work. The whole work was called Against the Heathen in 2 books. Because the first half of that book, which is what we are going to discuss today, looks at paganism as a system from the form of idolatry, different types of idolatry that the common people practiced, So even the very philosophical form of paganism, which the philosophers practiced, he looks at that in a systemic way, dismantles it and shows its incoherence. Then he starts building up the superiority of the Christian philosophical system, which is primarily dealing with the logos. Then after that, he talks about the incarnation of the logos, logos meaning word. So that's where on the incarnation picks up.
I see. So I know that during my catechesis, actually before, part of what led me to the doors of an Orthodox church was this Saint Athanasius, and coming to realize who this man was in Christian history. You know, and I mean, if you named the 5 most influential Christians who ever lived, including apostles, he'd be on that list of 5. You know, I mean, he was. As I often tell people, he's why we're not Jehovah's Witnesses today.
And I mean, also, you bring up the apostles. His title in our church is the apostolic, and I find that very fitting because he's a very clear expounder of the apostolic system. I mean, as we'll discuss today, the people listening to us will see that he really expanded on what the apostles laid down and made it super clear for people who are not familiar with the scriptures of what he was talking about, especially when it comes to the word of God, the logos.
So in my understanding, this prior writing, in as much as it's a standalone, you know, and can be such, also it gives us, I think its value as a precursor to on the Incarnation is that it introduces us to certain concepts and terms as he would use them. So when we encounter something, you know, certain terms like natural, rational, these various words that may mean one thing in English, I know you really have to kind of pick it up in the context as he would use the word in order to then take it forward into on the Incarnation and understand those same concepts there. And I've also noticed, you know, many of the translations of these older writings are in a kind of an antiquated English to us, you know, certainly not in our most modern vernacular in some that I've encountered. And I'm of the understanding that these were very often translated by either Protestant translators or, you know, people who might have introduced certain translation terms in a way that maybe would not be the best ones for us to use now. And so there are more recent translations. I know the one from St. Vlad is a really good one that I'm reading right now. Really, really nice, accessible translation. So I'd like for you to kind of start with some of the concepts and terms, the concepts that he was speaking, because I think what we can lose as Orthodox and as anybody in any philosophical system is the understanding that what's being conveyed are not memorizable phrases and words. You know, I see some that are so bent on the canons, or using this terminology or that one. But really what was being conveyed is concept, is idea, is way of explaining. And so what I'd like to do is have you move into some of those concepts that are introduced and some of the terms and what they convey conceptually as St. Athanasius uses those.
Well, that's quite a challenge, but I'm willing to discuss it. And I like the fact that you brought up vocabulary first, because these 7 spheres that we deal with when we come to understand any text are absolutely essential. Vocabulary is one of the most essential, as you see on there. But to address that point, I mean, I think we need to begin with the word logos itself. The word.
Oh, boy, that's huge, isn't it?
It's a huge, very huge word.
I want to hear you give a concise explanation of what a logos is.
You know, I don't know if we should discuss it out of order, because the way that this first book, which is called, I will refer to it by the Latin name, which is Contra Gentes, which means against the nations or the peoples or the heathen. He sets it out in 3 parts. The first part, he talks about idolatry and paganism and why it's incoherent as a system. Then he moves on to the rational soul which is the soul that distinguishes us from animals. Then he talks about the logos. So I don't know. I mean, we're having this discussion right now. Do you want me to get into the logos right now?
No, start at the beginning. Go ahead.
So he uses many different words. I think we know. I'll hold off on the logos for now because that's huge. That's what will lead us directly into the book on the Incarnation. But he uses words like rational and sense. So these are extremely important to know because they don't mean quite what we think them to mean. If we go back to that graphic with the 7 spheres, the other thing that we need to know besides vocabulary among the other two is historical context and cultural context. There was a philosophy in the ancient world called Platonism, and it was very widespread. It was very intelligent. It made sense of the world. It was better than what the pagans had, at least in the idolatrous form. And it really spread like wildfire, especially in the days, maybe in the century before Athanasius. It took off because it experienced a revival, a resurgence. So when we use the word rational, rational here means things that relate directly to the rational mind. What we understand is the rational mind, the intellect. Things that cannot be touched. We call them abstract concepts today as something, not real, something to simulate, but this is very wrong. And it shows our historical context. Because the fact that we consider these realities, and I use the word realities here, we consider them as something simulated in our minds, shows that we're living under a philosophy of materialism, where we don't acknowledge that anything exists except what is material, what can be sensed with the 5 senses.
Which is rather ironic because the very processes by which you come to that conclusion are non-materialistic in themselves.
Yeah, so the word rational here, there was a struggle in the ancient world between different philosophical schools. Plato, for example, he emphasized the rational world, the existence of the rational, or they call it intelligible world. Things like logic, mathematics, concepts by which we read and understand the world. These are realities. And I like to point out to people today that we can very easily show that they are real. Even if our minds did not exist, these realities would exist. Because we don't make this stuff up, we discover it. We're able to play with it to see how the system works, and it's objective to us. Those are also the same criteria by which we understand the material world. So if we acknowledge that the material world is real because it's external to us, it's unaffected by us, even if we're not there, and it's discoverable, so are all these abstract realities like logic and mathematics and morality and values.
I think what's worse is in order to reject those as realities, which if you are in a materialistic worldview, they cannot be realities, objective realities, because they're non-material. That's kind of a no-brainer. But in order to reject them as realities, as concrete realities, you have to use them to reject them.
Yeah.
You throw them out in the first place. These are the foundational. So you don't even get to talk. Like there's nothing left you get to say because you're throwing out laws of logic and laws of mathematics, all these things that you're using to come to this very conclusion of materialism, but you've basically cut off the branch you're sitting on that was supporting you in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean and he really gets into this, St. Athanasius, this is his genius and clarity. He goes deep into this to show how these realities exist. But that's because in these philosophical systems, there was an argument, a debate. Do we have non-physical realities? And if we do, that's evidence of the rational world and the rational soul. Because just like we're able to understand the material world through our senses, because we ourselves are material, we're able to understand the intelligible world, the rational world, the abstract world, because we ourselves have something in us that's not physical, which is the soul.
In which case you have to account for it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you know, your most basic rule of cause and effect, a cause cannot impart to its effect what it doesn't possess.
Yeah.
So if we are actually rational beings, and if we certainly do observe and employ these things, and they are non-material, then that points us to a cause that bears these same qualities.
Yes. So, I mean, he goes into that and he traces out the cause as the logos. You kind of anticipated what he says. And like I said, it's very interesting because when we come to rational realities, these non-physical realities that exist, we actually can't understand anything in the universe without them. People say, oh no, we go out and we experiment. Well, true. But we don't draw out the information from matter itself, from the world itself. We can only understand it as it exhibits the nature of those rational realities, like logic, like mathematics. The reason we can determine orbits is because we have mathematics. The reason we can determine how fast a rainstorm will come is because of mathematics. Otherwise, there is no determination other than, oh my gosh, it's raining right now, run. And that's a reaction.
My knee hurts. Huh? My knee hurts.
Right. Those are reactions. They're not understandings. In order to understand something, you actually detach yourself from the situation and turn it into concepts into the mind to understand. And those concepts.
What I'd like you to touch on a little bit that I think is kind of important, when we talk about some of these concepts that were born out of Platonism or borrowed from Platonism, it's important for us to understand that it's not that we co-opted a philosophical system so much as we took certain language and concepts and as I heard one person say, we baptized them. So, yeah.
I would even go on a different route than what they say baptize. I don't think they even baptize them. I think philosophy is the way that we understand the world and actually come to objective conclusions about it. So I like to differentiate between philosophical method, philosophical discoveries, and philosophical doctrines.
That's huge. That is huge. You hear people saying, well, St. Paul, about not following empty philosophies. And I hear so many people confuse the methodologies and the concepts with the systems of philosophy that were laid out. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at too, is that we didn't adopt the Platonic system as a whole.
Right. And what I like to point out, because people, they come in and they say, Paul speaks against philosophy. I totally agree. Which one of the three senses does he speak against? Because if you're going to point out method and discoveries, he uses those. But if you're going to point out doctrines, so these philosophical schools, when they interpreted the objective discoveries, they tried to explain why they were that way. So for example, with the world, one group, which was Platonism, said there must be a maker, a craftsman of the universe. He made the universe into what it is because of the order that they see. Others said, oh, it's because the universe is alive. We're alive. We have order in our bodies. This universe is just the body of a supreme God, the highest God in the world, and that's why it has order. So for example, that second doctrine, we rejected absolutely. That's Stoicism, which was one philosophical school in the ancient world. So those doctrines we reject. But the methodology, how do we discover that the world has order? That we accept. Method, do we follow logic? We accept. And there's another thing. I hear a lot when people discuss Arius and the later heretics, they say they used logic, not theology. They didn't. It wasn't the logic that led them.
A simple sentence without relying on logic.
Yeah. So, if that's the case, then every single church father that wrote is pretty much guilty of the same crime that Arius did. But it's not a crime. The problem with Arius is he introduced an assumption that was not shared by the church fathers, which is if you have a child, a son, he must be younger and different than the father that begot him.
Was he trying to resolve a problem such as Trinitarianism, how we can be monotheistic and have this apparent two gods or three gods? Was he trying to resolve something and just went about it in a very poor way?
I don't know if I can answer that question conclusively, But what baffles me is with the logos, the word of God, and I'll use that term throughout. So when the people hear me using logos, I refer to the word of God as Christ. I use the Greek word logos, which is the original Greek. But you have church fathers that wrote about the logos. Ignatius of Antioch, just maybe 10, 15 years after the Apostle John reposed. Then you have Justin Martyr talk about the logos. Then Athenagoras, the apologist. Then Irenaeus of Lyon, then Origen. And you know what they all have in common? Is that they said that the logos is uncreated, meaning they place him with God. This is God himself. Then Arius comes along and says, oh no, he's like God. Or in some other forms of Arianism, he's the first creation of God. And it's like, I wonder, did they read the fathers that came before them?
Jehovah's Witness, it's essentially the same, at least that portion of it is essentially the same belief.
Yeah, some aspects of there's the idea that Christ is created, but they go further with doctrines about the identity of Christ that Arius did not share. So, we have to understand the philosophical background, the background with Arius, and I point out that these two books were written at a time where Arianism was not problematic. Some people say maybe before the whole controversy, which would make Athanasius a teenager when he wrote it. Others say maybe when he was bishop, like right when he became bishop, and Arius had just been reprimanded by the Council of Nicaea, so he was not going to do something to bring that up again. The issue was over. So do we know for sure? No, we don't know for sure when he wrote it. Can we give a time period? I think we can. It's pre-Arian controversy because we don't have specific Trinitarian language in there. We don't have him referring to any groups in Christianity that believe in such a way. So I'd say 318 to 328. Can we narrow it down further than that? I think to be safe and honest, probably not so much further. Some tend toward the later date. There was a Catholic cardinal. His name was Cardinal Avery Dulles. He wrote a book called The History of Apologetics, which I highly recommend. And he seemed to think Athanasius wrote it just about the time he had become a bishop of Alexandria. Father John Baer, too, of St. Vladimir's Seminary, thinks toward that line of reasoning, too. But any later than that, it's very difficult to make that argument because Arianism was a thing at that time. And if he's not referencing it, he referenced it in every other work he wrote after that. So
Good. We'll go on with some of the Greek terms and concepts that we will need to understand as we move forward from against the heathens to on the Incarnation.
So we explained rational. It refers to realities that are not physical, and what they mean that they're real, they're objective, they exist on their own, they're eternal. Rational realities, they're eternal. Like 1 + 1 = 2. That will never change from the beginning of time to the end of the universe, whether we're here or not. Because
when he speaks of rational beings, he's speaking of those who are able to conceive of these in juxtaposition to all the other creatures which are animate but incapable of this sort of conceptual approach to reality.
Right. So back to the philosophers. Plato and Aristotle identify 3 types of soul, which is the vegetative soul, that which makes plants grow, the animal soul, which allows creatures to move as they wish, then the rational soul, which only exists in humanity and allows us to reason and understand the world around us.
Yeah, some. I don't know if you've been on Facebook. Yeah, I wouldn't say all.
and what's important to note here is that we have a measure of all 3 souls existent in our souls. And Plato gives a really nice division. He says the rational soul is divided into 3 parts, which is the mind or the intellect. They call it in Greek nous. Then you have this thing he calls the spirited element. He identifies it with the chest. So the mind is identified with the head, and the spirited element is identified with the chest. The best way I can clarify it to the audience, it's like the emotions, but it's independent of doing anything on its own. It's not dependent on anything else. So it doesn't act on its own. It has to have something that moves it.
Would instincts kind of...
No. So that's the third one I'm coming to. So the third part of humanity that he identified, the soul, is what he calls the appetites, which a good way to express is instincts. So the idea that, we're hungry, we need food, or, we're tired, we need to go to sleep, or we've gotten angry, so we want to react. Those are called the appetites, the instincts. So Plato says that you should line up your emotions with your mind. Let them rule them so that they learn to enjoy what is good and to hate what is bad. Because if you don't, then the appetites will rule the emotions. Then you get the phrase that we understand today, I do what I feel like.
This is very close to the body, soul, nous, tripartite composition that is in the early Christianity and the fathers and throughout our faith.
Yeah, and I mean, there are quite a bit of differences because Paul was the one who laid out the tripartite theology of the human being, the anthropology. But I mean, it lines up very close. So when we don't use the mind to rule the instincts, the appetites through the emotions, Plato makes a comparison, and what I'm referring to comes from the book The Republic by Plato. He really lays out this idea of the human being and the human soul in there. The mind is like the rulers of a country. And the heart, the chest, the spirited element is like the soldiers. And the appetites are like the businessmen. If the rulers do not rule the merchants, then the merchants will rule the country, kind of like corporate America, right? And it leads to the greatest injustice that we can see. They're concerned about making money. People are treated as assets. They are not given dignity. So he says if the human does not train the mind to rule the emotions, and through the emotions to rule the appetites, the instincts, the urges, then it leads to injustice within the human being himself, between me and myself, me and others, and the state as a whole.
And when we talk about mind, we are speaking both of the observational, or actually all of the above, the observational, the deliberative, and the decisive, the will, all as part of that, what we're referring to as mind.
Yeah. So Athanasius really emphasizes the part about judgment. We as human beings, and this is what separates us from the creatures, is that we can lay out many scenarios in front of us and choose the best one, and that's judgment making. We make decisions, and when we do that, for example, if somebody comes up and talks really bad against me and I get really angry, but I hold myself, I've used my mind to rule my instincts. But the people who don't use their minds to rule the instinct uses the mind to get what it wants. So they get up, they see a chair, and they slam it on the head of the other person. They let their urges get the best of them. And Aristotle has a great quote referring to this type of behavior. He says, man, when perfected, meaning when he's brought to his end, when he does what he's supposed to do with his mind the right way, man, when perfected, is the highest of all the creatures. But when sundered from law and justice, he is the worst of them all. Then he goes on to why, because humans have weapons. Humans have indulgences. He specifically points out gluttony and fornication. This is what humans drift to when they let go of their minds. Violence, overeating, overindulgence there, and sex unrestrained.
Yeah, certainly animals don't have these expressions within them. They're much more simple in their expression of instinct.
Yeah, and animals, most of the time, they will eat until filled. Then after that, they step away from food. They have mating seasons. Human beings, when they let themselves go, will engage in those activities all year round, around the clock. So it's evidence that they're using the mind to do something that's not natural to creatures. And this is what Plato really fears, because if the appetites use the mind, which is capable of foreseeing results that come out of decisions, then it leads to the greatest possible destruction.
Wow. Very interesting.
So in a nutshell, that's what he means by rational. He goes on then, talks about sense perception, sensuality. And the idea is that you just allow the urges of the body to control who you are and what you do. And that's really where his discussion begins. He talks about paganism and why people practice it, and he actually traces it back to the fall of man. He says the whole idea, he expresses the fall in this way, and this is where his genius comes in, where you see that he has a clear audience in mind and really knows their background, that they're followers of Plato, that they've read form, that they're pretty much kind of convinced with his teachings. He points out that at the beginning of creation, what caused the fall was human beings, instead of choosing what was good, what was rational, which is to follow God, not to touch of the fruit of the tree of the garden of good and evil, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they chose rather to do it, which is they're letting their sense overrule their thinking. Their sense perceptions, what they are urging to do, it ruled their ability to lay out the best decisions in front of them.
You know, I have heard the fall very eloquently described as a inversion of our tripartite composition, flipping it upside down. You know, we're using the body, soul, and spirit, nous, will composition is this flipping of those when man fell, and having the body now at the top and the soul in the middle and the will at the bottom.
Yeah, so in this case, we can see how the early church was really able to communicate the gospel to the Greeks, because they had that idea too. The appetites, if we may, they're the body by itself. The mind is the intellect by itself. And that middle element, which is identified with the chest, is what connects the two. It's inverted when humans act like beasts and lose their rational natures because they've inverted the system. And actually, like Aristotle said, worse than beasts.
The introduction of the gospel at the time when we had these, at the time, modern highway systems that connected the whole known world, this Greek philosophical language, which I've always thought is about as close as you can get to understanding without divine revelation, without God directly instructing you, just as creatures that kind of grope around down here trying to figure it out by observing it. It seems to me that all of this was so incredibly in place right as a stage that was set with all the props, enter Christ.
Yeah, and the church fathers noticed that. Clement of Alexandria gives a very nice analogy. He says, you know, Paul wrote that the tutor to the Jews to lead them to Christ was the law. That's in Galatians. But the tutor to the Greeks was philosophy, because it discovered things about the nature of God through contemplation. I'll share something right now. So, for example, goodness is the nature of God himself. Something is not good because God commands it, but it is good because it is aligned to the nature of God. And evil is a departure from that nature. Now, this was Christian theology. Plato seemed to believe that there was some type of evil element in matter, especially the Neoplatonists. But Christians pointed out evil is when we choose the worse for the better. It's related to choices, not to the composition of things. This is why some people may have heard it said that evil, it's actually doesn't exist on its own. It's like light and darkness. Darkness has no substance. Light is made out of photons, energy waves, but darkness has no substance. You can only recognize it because something is missing, which is the light.
You know, I remember something in C.S. Lewis, and if I'm not mistaken, I could be, he was quoting and kind of expounding on Augustine with the concept that nobody does evil for its own sake. Nobody pursues evil because it's evil, although we do pursue good because it's good. Yeah. That all evil act is an inordinate attempt at a good.
And I like that, because that word inordinate, it means in order. Well, what order? It's the order from mind to the chest to the appetites. That's the order that we should do things. But human beings when they fall away from that, they turn it around. It's the appetites, whatever I feel like. Then the emotions really want it. I want it now. Then they lead the mind to do what they want from their appetites.
But there's generally some root or core of something that in its proper context and place is a good thing.
Yeah.
Just a wrong way about going about trying to obtain it.
Yeah. So for example, I mean, we can give an analogy with the cocoa bean, or the cocoa plant. We can make chocolate from it or cocaine. Which one are we going to do? And again, it's related to the choice, not to the object. It's because cocaine doesn't exist in nature. It has to be done through a chemical process. They really have to squeeze out the
even theft. The concept of wanting to know that what you want and what you need will be there for you, that's in and of itself is not bad. I mean, this is, the idea of that there is a purpose and a meaning, that we are supposed to have certain things, and this lack of them, this fear of lack of them driving these things. But it really at the core is the concept of providence, which is a good core, that we should have a concept of providence. But rather than turning to God in trust of his providence, you're grasping to try and get a hold of it for yourself. So at the core, there is something that isn't bad in itself. It's just an inordinate way of trying to get there.
Right. And they really expounded on that. This is one of the biggest Christian contributions to philosophy, that they identified evil as non-existence, not something that exists, but choosing the less for the better. And what I find interesting here is that the Platonists did not believe in sin. This was a big difference between Christianity and Platonism. They believed that whatever the human did evil, it didn't affect the soul, because the soul was trapped in the body. And even Plato would say soma sema, which in Greek means the body is a prison. So it's this idea that the body is a prison for the soul, and that anything evil that we do, it's to be related to that aspect of humanity, which is the matter, the fleshly, the bodily. And
this hard line of dualism, which really kind of was at the core of Gnosticism as well, is actually very similar to some Protestant thought. Which,
yeah, I think fundamentally Protestants of all shapes and sizes, except those who maybe read in history, they go back to the medieval thinkers and even the church fathers, they are Gnostic in many ways. They see the body as something evil. They don't engage in the sacraments. The body can in no way be incorporated in worship.
Well, and there's, with this juridical idea of salvation as essentially God's ledger. And once you've had the term is double imputation. So once our sins are imputed to Christ and he bears them and gets punished for them, and his righteousness is imputed to us, well, now we become a perfect spiritual reality, and what we do in the flesh does not alter the perfection of that spiritual reality. And so this was one of the earliest things that just blew me away when I was looking into orthodoxy, how composite the human is in the Orthodox understanding, and nothing that affects one part doesn't affect the other two, that they're woven together. They're one human being, these three different aspects, and the spirit and the body are so knitted together that it also gave me, for the first time, a true love for what it is to be human, and an understanding that human is good, that these things that we saw, when I was going through my conversion process, one of the big questions I had when that got answered, everything fell into place. And everybody kept telling me, you don't understand the Incarnation. You don't understand the Incarnation. Once I grasped that concept, it was like all the pieces just gelled, and I was Orthodox. And the question that I kept asking is it from God or from man? Because man was this rotten, fallen reality. And you see in the scriptures, is it from men or from God? What I didn't grasp was the concept of man with God in him, that there's nothing wrong with that which is man. It's the absence of God that gives man this warped expression of that which is good if it's properly oriented towards God. And so here we find again that this very closeness to this Platonic concept of separating the two out, and the one is good and the one is rotten, where in orthodoxy, we don't say that. The human is not rotten. It's the human without God that's rotten. And it's by bringing them together, which is what the whole point of the incarnation was, that the human is made to be human.
Yeah, and I find it interesting because I heard this a while ago, that the religion of America is Platonism, not Christianity, the mainstream religion in America. And it's actually, I hate to say it, it's true, because this dualism, that the body, no matter what you do with it, as long as you're saved, you're always saved, that is not Christianity. And that excludes the body from any type of way of approaching God. And like you said, it's the order in which we do things. The body does approach God, but it has to be following the soul, the rational soul, in its approach to God. And it's no coincidence, because Platonism made a major resurgence in the century before Protestantism, the Reformation, happened. You know, all the works of Plato were rediscovered in their Greek. Sorry, let me go back. Not rediscovered. That's a misconception about the Renaissance. Translated into Latin and actually read in Greek for the first time in the West. So they got mystified. Wow, this guy, he was really wise. And don't get me wrong, he is wise. When I read his works, I get moved. But we have to separate between the objective discoveries and the doctrines that are interpretations of those discoveries.
And I think the things that, if we do have the image of God in us, we are bound to come across some very profound truths without special revelation. And they might just have this little bit of error, this twist here or there that doesn't fit. I went to a Buddhist temple. I was doing some work there, and I asked him to show me around. I was blown away. I mean, it was like you would swear this was born out of the same father that Orthodoxy was born out of. You had monks with robes, you had icons, you had the writings, you had the mats with prostrations, you had an altar with relics. I mean, it was like, you know, how is this so close? And obviously there was no connection, none whatsoever in their origins. It's just that this human has an awareness of God in him, even without the special revelation. It just doesn't have the pinpointing. It needs the perfect image to show itself and show us who God is.
And you know, it reminds me of Paul at the Areopagus when he preached to the Greeks in Athens. At least in the New Revised Standard Version, which is pretty accurate in its translation from Greek, he says that the nations try to feel around for God. They're like blind people, but they know kind of the direction where to go, and feeling can only get you so much of an understanding. But sight, the light, which is an attribute of the Logos, he enlightens. That only comes from Christ himself.
So you need an image or an icon to see it in its reality.
Yeah, for what you're trying to feel, what you're feeling around, you're trying to represent it in an icon, but it can't get there without the light. No matter how well you can feel things, it's not like seeing them. Our understanding as human beings is largely based on the sight.
Absolutely.
So it's, you know, we talk about this idea of evil. Christianity attributes the evil to human choices because the human is body and soul and spirit. The Platonists attribute the evil to the flesh, to the body, so the spirit is unaffected. And that's just, even in observation. And that's why Christianity as a philosophical system was able to challenge Platonism. The human being changes based on the things that they do with their body. And that is, that's the soul. So it's evident that the soul is affected by the actions of the body. And this is where St. Athanasius...
And these are symbiotic, right? It's not just the soul affected by the body, but when the soul then moves and the mind acts, that has an effect back. There's a symbiosis going on of a descent or an ascent in our realities, is there not?
Yeah, and St. Athanasius uses this analogy early on in the book. He's actually borrowing from a book of Plato called the Phaedrus, where the three parts of the human being, the mind, the chest, the spirited element that is, and the appetites are represented as a charioteer and two horses. One horse is the appetites, the other horse is the spirited element, and the charioteer is the intellect. These horses are running and they can't stop. It is the goal, and they're going in different directions. It is the goal of the charioteer to rein them in so that they run in the same direction and reach the goal. So this is the relationship, the symbiotic relationship between the body, the soul, and the spirit. And Athanasius, what he does at this point, the genius, he's now discussed the nature of evil and how it's not related to matter, it's related to choices. We choose the less for the better. He now introduces the idea of sin and what it is in the Christian understanding. So sin for him, it's a disorder in humanity. I mean, like we said, inordinate. We're not following the right order, but it's also a disorder. We're consistently choosing the less, the worse for the better. And sin is evil. But it has no existence on its own. So salvation is what delivers us from sin. But soteria in Greek, which means salvation, also means healing. And his whole thesis in the two books is that the cross has healed humanity. Now, this is important because if this is how he's conceptualizing sin, and by the way, this runs through all the fathers, except maybe the Latin fathers starting in the 5th century. But this idea, up until his time and much after him, is what sin is. It's a disorder in humanity. It's not being fixed. It's getting worse as time goes on. And for this reason, it has to be healed. So this is why when we come back to this idea of a retributive punishment, how will that get rid of the problem, the root of the problem? Because a punishment cannot fix a disorder. Maybe it can fix the person who's doing it, take away opportunities.
In reality, in the Protestant, and when you hear me use this word, this isn't universally across the board, it just generally speaking. But in that concept, it's divine justice that is the issue. And really, when it comes down to the bottom, to the core of the issue, it's God that gets healed. So you're pointing to how can punishment heal? Well, it can't heal the offender, but in the Protestant concept, that's where this doesn't fit together because you're applying that concept to an Orthodox understanding. But if you apply it to a Protestant understanding, God is offended and requires satisfaction. So in reality, yes, the punishment does heal. It heals God. It heals the agitation within God, the offense within God, and justice. You'll hear the term like, oh, it satisfies justice. But in reality, either justice is an attribute of God or it's an external reality to which God is subject. And if it's an attribute within him, then really what is we're talking about healing with punishment is God, not man.
Right, because it's God that, I hate to say this, it's almost as he has the appetites and they have to be satisfied even at the expense of his mind. And there is no division like that in God. God is pure spirit. And I know there's a lot of debate about this in the Coptic community because no matter how orthodox we get, we are still living in a Protestant society. And their resources are a lot easier to get to than our resources are. And sadly, a lot of priests can maybe even fall into that. I
think it goes beyond that. I mean, we're taking a short tangent here, but what we really lack in the Coptic world that I've seen is systematic theology. Because when we approach a question, we approach it typically in the Coptic church from the viewpoint of patristics, and it ends up being a bunch of quote mines, and there's never that point where you have to take all of your conclusions and put them together into a coherent system that satisfies our understandings of all the other aspects. So if you asked a Copt, does God get agitated and need to be healed? They would say no. But if what you're believing over here is actually necessitating that, it's only through systematic theology that you see the clash between those two concepts. And if you just approach it patristically, you may not get to that point. You have to be able to take the concepts and see, do they all dovetail with each other and fit nicely into a coherent understanding?
Right. And I mean, I'll go so far as to say, I know it's going to seem very literary of me, literary criticism, and that word usually used raises a lot of shivers. Ooh, this is a field where people are going crazy. But we can't understand a text without knowing what the literary movement that came before it was and what came after it. And in the case of systematic theology, these two books for Athanasius, Contra Gentes and On the Incarnation of the Word, they do present a system. And like I said, here's an example of his articulation of sin. And when you go back to the fathers before him, they have the same idea. It's a disorder. If you go to the fathers after him, the same idea. It's a disorder. Even the Latin fathers who start introducing the idea of punishment, the idea of disorder is still there. And this is what makes it extremely important for how we understand the work of God as it comes later, because if sin is a disorder, punishment can never, ever heal it. It's the wrong tool. It's like me trying to get a kid to understand something in class, and I yell at him. The yelling will not. Maybe the yelling will get him to behave a little bit, but it can never, ever fundamentally get him to learn on his own. I need to teach to do that. He'd need to listen. It's a totally different action. So, like I said, the whole thesis of the two books is that the cross has healed humanity. And this is important because when we get onto the incarnation of the Word, where St. Athanasius now talks about the crucifixion and the resurrection and what they mean, this is the concept of sin that we have to have in our minds. If we have the idea of it's an offense against God, we've already misinterpreted on the incarnation. And that's why I think we really have to read Contra Gentes again. And I hope as time moves on, the two books are read together.
Wonderful. Now, there's another concept that I'd like to move into, this concept of nature and us and God and our respective natures, and what that means as St. Athanasius uses that term, that which is natural.
So again, it's when we think natural, things that happen on their own, things that we can perceive with the senses. But again, the word nature in Greek denotes a whole bunch of other things. For example, when Aristotle says, what does it mean for a human to be natural? It means that we're using our mind to rule everything else in our being. We rule the appetites and the emotions. If we say, what does it mean for God to be natural? Is that he's guiding and directing the universe. What's it mean for an animal to be natural? It means to be submissive to his environment, reactive to it. So nature here, he uses it in a variety of ways. But part 3, he uses it to denote the universe. Because he says that humans can know God through 2 ways. Through the existence of the rational soul within, and through the existence of the harmony and order of nature without. And I think maybe it's a good time now to get into what he means by nature. So there's a background to the fathers on how they understand nature. And it's this concept called the book of nature. So it's very telling, it's very ingenious, and it starts in the scriptures. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows the creation of his hands. It's actually, you have it right there? So it's twofold. The first half of the psalm is talking about how nature bears witness to God. The second half about the scriptures, because the law here, it's Torah in Hebrew. And it's referring to the 5 books of Moses, which was the Bible in the time of David the king. So the heavens declare the glory of God, and so does the Torah. Scripture and nature. And nature comes first. nature existed before revelation. And you go to the church fathers, whether it's the Syrians, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the Romans, they all have this idea of nature and scripture work together. But there's this idea further that nature is a book that we have to read in order to understand God. And it's interesting because Athanasius himself describes it in such a fashion. In this quote from it's the bridge into part 3, he has just finished talking about the soul. He says, if the soul's own teaching is insufficient, by reason of the external things which cloud its intelligence, and prevent it seeing what is higher, yet it is further possible to attain to the knowledge of God from the things which are seen. Since creation, as though in written characters, meaning letters, it's a book. He's describing it as a book. Declares in a loud voice by its order and harmony its own Lord and Creator. So I like to give that image, that just like we read regular books, we are reading nature itself. And it's also very telling because in the past 100 years, we have really received insight through research into what actually goes on when we read. Most people who are educated think of reading as a process. Oh, there are letters on a page. I'm like a computer. I read them and I can pull out the meaning. It is a lot more complicated than that. And I've had the privilege of teaching students who are way above grade level. I had kids who, middle school were reading at college levels and reasoning at that level too. I had kids reading at grade level and kids who are reading way below grade level. I mean, kids that are still learning how to sound out words in 8th grade.
Wow, interesting.
So
in the Western Protestant world, there's a term they call the very, very much the same, and I'm sure it comes from the same sources, but they refer to the natural revelation, I think, and the scriptural revelation, something like that. And I remember, I think it was George Florovsky who said he referred to nature as a manifestation more than a revelation. I thought that was a really interesting distinction, that it's there, it's not something you even, that he has to make seen. It's evident, it's already there, plain and clear in front of us.
Yeah, and I'd like to share a couple of slides that I prepared to take from reading theory, and a theory which I believe, I've studied many theories. This theory is tried and true, and as a teacher who has taught kids across all skill levels, this theory really describes what goes on in the mind as we read. And I'm going to apply that theory to the idea of nature as a book, because it lines up and I think it will sum up perfectly what Athanasius was trying to do in part 3. And this is my own personal research. So you won't find this written out there in the world. You won't find it in articles. It's something that I'm working on and trying to develop day by day. So the idea that nature is a book, and we saw Athanasius himself describe it as written in letters, characters. When we read books, people have this visualization. You have the book, it's the objective reality, the thing, and we have us, the passive individual. The message of the book goes straight into our minds, and voila, we understand the book. Try that with a kid who's reading below grade level, and good luck. They will never understand a thing. And this is why I think actually we have an epidemic in America, why people don't understand, because of it's this one way understanding of what happens between a book and a person. But the reality is, the background that we have goes back to the text and becomes the lens through which we read that text. It's almost as if it's translating the notations on the text, the letters. This is why background is essential. This is why I always start with background. Because when we, for example, we talked about Platonism, Neoplatonism, the rational mind, rational realities, sense experience, nature of evil. Anybody reading this book without that background, they may say, oh, that's nice. Those are nice musings. But they fail to see the gravity of what Athanasius is actually arguing. So the idea is that a transaction happens between us reading the book and us negotiating the knowledge that we already have. If it's correct, then to the clarification of the text. If it's incorrect and not there, then to the total miscomprehension of the text. But it actually happens in a transaction. And why? Because that transaction is appealing to things that are both external to the book and myself. The fact that English as a language exists apart from me and the book, and we both participate in that language, allows me to filter that through as a lens to understand the book. But also because I have tools like vocabulary, historical context, background, and so on. So it's the transaction where it is in the transaction between the reader and the book that the meaning of a text comes out. And it's to various factors. We know the letters, we know the words in the book. We have the same common background as the author and the contents of the book. But both of these are external to the book itself. Now let's bring it to nature. Let's pretend that book again that we see in front of here is nature. And we have us, the people that are observing nature. It's only in the transaction between mind, the mind that we have, the rational soul, and nature, that the understanding of the universe comes out, what we know as science. But it's due to various factors. We know the letters and words in the book, which are logic and mathematics, those rational realities. But here's the problem, and here's where it really gets interesting. We have the same common background as the author and the contents of the book, because we're both rational beings, spirits, like God, and we're also matter, like the universe itself. But here's the kicker. If we can understand the universe, it's because that there is something in it that's external to both myself and the universe, and that is the Logos. Because the Logos made the universe, and we're created in his image. And for that reason, when we recognize him in it, we can comprehend the universe.
This is very, very interesting. I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about, in his lifetime, people reading his writings and not ascribing to him ideas that were just totally not what he had in mind. And that was within his lifetime. So it's not this, you have to start with an understanding of what you're taking into the text. I very often get involved, or used to get more so involved, in argumentation online. I found it very interesting, but I kind of came to a point where I realized if a person doesn't acknowledge their own bias in the beginning of the conversation, I can't go anywhere, because they'll never be able to acknowledge really anything. If there's not self-awareness, where do you go from there? If you don't acknowledge that, yes, I'm approaching this with my own mindset, my own bias, nobody goes in as a blank slate approaching any text.
Yeah, and I mean, it's actually an entire theory of knowledge, this transaction. But I like that you mentioned C.S. Lewis, because he wrote a book called An Experiment in Criticism, and he pretty much expressed approval of this view. And it's true. It's like I said, I mean, it's...
Now, from nature in another way that I've seen in Athanasius was that God by nature exists, and man by nature does not exist, because he was brought into existence by another, is sustained in his existence by another. I think we don't maybe appreciate the fact that we are not given our being all at once. It is given to us moment by moment by moment, as it is sustained by another, because we did not create ourselves or this universe. And that being the case, it is sustained by something external, moment by moment by moment. And if that reality stopped imparting existence and sustaining it, we would simply stop being. And so by our nature, in ourselves, we are not. We are brought into being by him, but he by nature in himself is.
Yeah, so if I were to give an analogy, for example, of light. So let's pretend that the light is the Logos, because the light is the Logos is the light. And being able to see is our existence as human beings. The only reason we can live is because that light continues shining. As soon as that light stops, everything goes with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's such an important theme that, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little, that we move into with on the Incarnation, is this concept of being, not being, the descent of humanity.
So yeah, the idea is, and that goes back to part one. So we jump to part three. Then part one, he talks about, humanity is falling into non-being. He really gets more into that at the beginning of the book on the Incarnation, but he presents the seeds for that in part one of his book, Contra Gentes. He talks about the idea that humanity is falling deeper and deeper into the abyss. And the deeper they get, the more and more they justify unacceptable behavior with the gods. So like Athanasius points out, that the gods themselves, that they worship and consider holy, these gods are accused, and just Zeus alone, and he's alluding to the Iliad and the Odyssey. So that's one more text that we have to have a general familiarity with before approaching Athanasius. But Zeus kidnaps, he engages in homosexuality with minors, he's an adulterer, he has grief over the death of his son, grief for a god. He's unable to control his emotions, he is unable to help his son, so he's weak, he's not omnipotent. He is helped by a demigod and immortal. He's overcome by his pleasures, he shapeshifts to hide himself. He hides from his father after he figures out that his father's evil, and he binds and castrates his own father, Kronos.
Wow. He sounds like a sort of a tyrannical deity. Tyrannical king that would be very mortal, which is, I think, another huge thing that you would expect any man-made religions to be very reflective of and comprehensible by humanity. But some of the paradoxes you see in Christianity that really kind of defy logical categories or observation, like, before time began. Mm-hmm. What instinct in a humanity would think there was such a thing as before time began? That, in some of these paradoxes, the Trinity, I mean, if you were going to create deity, you'd make one that you could comprehend, the hypostatic union. You'd make something that humanity can truly grasp, and not these things that you have to kind of chalk some of it up to, I don't get it, and I can't, because it transcends.
Yeah, and he really gives a very, very sharp critique, but in a graceful way. He says, why is it fitting to regard as a god one who has perpetrated such deeds, and who stands accused of things which not even the public laws of the Romans allow those to do who are merely men? In another place, he says that the Christians live more chastely than the Greek gods. So
that's huge. I mean, that right there, just the very concept that God would be whatever it is he would, that would be properly moral, he would be exponentially more so, which, does again bring us back to like issues of is vengeance versus turn the other cheek. Here he's, this Christian God is telling us all to turn the other cheek, but he can't let the slightest offense go without getting retribution against somebody. This would fall under those same problems Athanasius would point out, like, hey, this doesn't fit. He has to be, whatever is moral and true and right, he would have to be exponentially more so, which, I don't know, for me, that is one thing that I've turned to many times in my own sense of failure as a Christian, that he calls on me, because at some point you feel like a broken record going to confession, same thing over and over, and you feel like, he can't keep forgiving this. This is nonsense. This is crazy. And then, when I realized that he says, forgive 70 times 7, And if he tells me that, he must be exponentially more so that that attribute, that forgiveness. It's something I've had to turn and cling to many times in my Orthodox life.
Yeah, and I mean, it hits at a spiritual and emotional point for believers. It's when sometimes we can't forgive ourselves, he forgave us. And that's really the dominant message of the Incarnation, is that God became as we are in our weaknesses, all except for sin.
I mean, doesn't he say, if it were a matter of offense only, repentance would cover it?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the beginning of the Incarnation.
Yeah,
But
and is that not, I mean, what he tells us to do with others who've offended us is, to forgive.
yeah. But, again, it's the idea of the disorder. Something has happened to humanity that needs to be fixed. We became disordered, and that's the idea of sin. And again, when we try to draw out of Athanasius the idea of God, forgave us our sins because Jesus took our punishment in our place, there are probably two places in this entire 2-volume work that they can appeal to, and the translations show something different, number one. But it's the idea of a disorder. Why is he talking about punishment now? How will punishing a disordered individual, and not only individual, the humanity itself, how will punishing the humanity itself that has a disorder fix the problem? And the problem has to be fixed from within. And this is what I also want to come to, because people approach this text and they don't think of the sacraments, but the sacraments are all over the book in the background. Athanasius does not mention them because the person he's writing to is an Orthodox Christian. But I want to point out that these sacraments that he has in mind are two specific ones, which are baptism and chrismation. While they're not mentioned in the book directly, again, part of the background, the historical background, cultural background, the early church believed in them. And they did not believe they were symbols. They believed they were effective communication of grace from God. But the idea of baptism, we're clothed and buried with Christ. He gives this great analogy on the Incarnation about Christ's work. What was it? We're stubble and Christ is asbestos. When we're covered in it, the fire will never affect us, even if we pass through the fire. And it actually is the idea of putting on Christ, which goes back to Romans and Galatians, which are expressive of baptism. But also the chrismation. So, okay, Christ came, he died for us, but how did he fix the problem? It's by living in us. When he lives in us, it's like the rays of the sun when they enlighten and purify something. Put something out in the sun that has bacteria or whatever, the bacteria dies just by being exposed to the sun. So it's this idea that because Christ lives in us, the change is happening from within, but it's slow. It goes on throughout our whole life. And, it's interesting that the philosophers of the 2nd century, when they described Christians, they described them as philosophers, but they do so by following the words of Christ, not by, rational reasoning and all that stuff. But they do it solely because they follow a man named Christ. By following his example, the result is that they live morally like the philosophers. And that's one thing I want to point out. These philosophical movements had a very heavy emphasis on morality. They rejected the Greek gods and the way that they behaved. They really focused on living a simple life in harmony with others, in harmony with oneself, which we forget totally these days. The West has this great, massive lie that if you're doing something to yourself and it's not hurting others, then it's not immoral. Oh, absolutely it is. Because, people who engage in these very bad behaviors, drug usage, abuse of alcohol, abuse of cigarettes, smoking 5 packs a day every day, when their bodies are being destroyed by that, it will affect the others around them sooner or later, especially if they have families.
Wow, absolutely. It's No, go on. Continue what you had prepared for this discussion. I'll ask you more questions at the end.
So the idea of the sacraments plays a big backdrop. I want to go back to the slide on the context. It's quite a bit far back. So, we talked quite a bit on historical and cultural context. The philosophies of the ancient world are a big backdrop, but also the sacraments. And again, the audience, I didn't mention the book was written to a Christian. It's not written to pagans and non-believers. It's written to a young man named Macarius. Some people think it's he's saying, "Oh, blessed one," but he says you're worthy of that name, so he's referring to an individual. He's writing to an individual. This individual became Christian. He needs to have a solid understanding of his faith, which again, he's setting up a system, and we can't understand systems without context, any type of system. So the purpose, I didn't mention it, but the purpose of the book primarily is an apologetic for the cross of Christ, the healing that it's affected, and the rationality of Christianity. So he starts off with the psychology of paganism after he gets into sin. And man, it's like, I don't even know where to begin. He was so far ahead of his time when talking about psychology. I mean, like Freud would have been like, hey, somebody said this before I did. And I mean, Freudian psychology, I have a lot of criticism of it, but it accurately describes the people who choose to let their appetites rule who they are. I mean, you see it in the people, all they care about is eating and drinking and, copulating and all that stuff. So he points out, and he really gets into it amazing. He talks about the core of paganism is forgetfulness. We forget who we are, what our nature is. And because of that, we choose the evil for the better. And eventually, as we keep choosing the sensual over the rational, we start rejecting that there is such a thing as rational. And it's ironic because that is exactly the civilization we believe in. Talk to anybody who doesn't believe in God, they also don't believe in the soul. So the idea of the paganism, it's an infection of the soul. And there again is the idea of disorder. This infection has to be healed, and it's been healed through the cross of Christ. Now, the motivation is hedonism of all types. I won't get into it. Most people, when they hear hedonism, they think of the sexual sort. But it's also the worship of the will. I can do whatever I want, which is also the foundational principle of the West. We imagine false things, fantasies, and we try to make them real. And because we follow those things, they don't exist. That's why evil is non-existence. So you hinted at the beginning, they don't pursue it because it's evil. You're right. They confuse it for what is good.
Yeah, well, there was this movie called The Addiction that's, to this day, the most profound treatment I've ever seen on the sin condition. And it uses a vampire genre in black and white. It's made back in the 90s. It's not that old, relative to me. And there was just this one line in it that I'll never forget. It says, the only relief that you find from the addiction is in the addiction itself. And it uses the infection of being bit by a vampire as like sin entering the soul. And it's basically saying the only moments you get of relief are indulging in the thing, which actually worsens and sickens you and perpetuates the condition. And you keep grasping in your imagination, and this, any addict is going, there's, a term, that first buzz or that virgin buzz, and just grasping and grasping, trying to get some relief by the very thing that's perpetuating and worsening the condition. And it's the only relief you find, but it keeps making you worse and worse. And this is just, an understanding of what sin is. And I think, honestly, I think addicts probably understand it better than most Copts.
Yes, more than any Christian, because they know how it's so difficult to get without. And it's something, it's caused me reflection too. We live in a civilization that has been partially converted to Christ, because the moral systems that we have, the values, the law, these are all derived from the historical reality that Christianity was the dominant faith in the West for hundreds of years. So while people may not know it, even the most hardened atheist, he's probably quite a bit Christian already. He just doesn't know it.
Well, and dealing with it on as though it were this legal matter and not moving into the ontology of it is just. I just read Florovsky the other day, who said, it was the most brilliant verbiage. He said, any juridical concepts of salvation are at best colorless anthropomorphisms. And it was just so brilliantly, concisely stated. He nailed it. It's just some kind of human term that really is colorless. It doesn't begin to move in to the color, to the depth of the whole sickness, the sin condition that we experience. And that's why I think addicts, especially ones who have, recovered and converted, really are so acutely aware of the dynamics of how sin works in a person, so much more than perhaps at times those who really didn't move down those roads, that didn't experience the devastation and the continuous. So that we tell ourselves, hey, we judge horizontally. Hey, this guy's a lot worse. I'm actually pretty good. I go to church every Sunday. I grew up in this church. I go to confession. I don't break any of the big sin laws. I'm actually doing pretty good. And not even take the time of introspection that it would take to realize the condition going on inside even you. And this is where the addict really has so often the upper hand, because he doesn't really need to dig in and introspect. It's screaming in front of him, the things that we would have to silently look in and dig for and see what's wrong in us. It's screaming in their faces, in our faces. I've been an addict. What's wrong, and your helplessness, your compulsion, your weakness, your need for something greater to come and bail you out. And I think this is where, the fathers, not all fathers are equal in all things. When we read, there's a reason why throughout all of Orthodoxy, Athanasius is the foundational stone of soteriology. You start there, and everybody, what makes something orthodox in my understanding is the affirmation of it by the entire church worldwide, and generation upon generation upon generation, affirming and building upon it. This is what I call like the chorus, the song of Christianity. And somebody introduces a new line, a new chorus into that song, and all those with a common ear, which is the Spirit, say, yes, this is, oh my gosh, this fits so perfectly. And then it gets added to the song, and this is a chorus that becomes foundational for the song. And then the next, and then somebody may add something and then add something else, and it's like this thing, this bad note. They go, whoa, 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 this doesn't fit. And you can have a Gregory of Nyssa who's taken in writings in some areas are so loved, and others leave that out. That doesn't fit,
Yeah, and I really like that analogy of the chorus. If it's in tune, it works. If
and
it's
everybody
not,
with the common ear knows, and it's the fact that the entire choir who has the same ear says, yes, that's it, that fits. That's what makes it orthodox.
yes, and that's a great analogy for the consensus patrum, the agreement of the fathers. Addicts, I think they are very keenly aware, because I think many times they're introspective. Some addicts, I don't think they reflect at all, and those are the ones that die young.
Yes.
But the ones who are able to carry it through, they know there's something wrong, and they want to get around it. And again, it's this idea of healing. Even the idea of therapy in the West. It's like people don't understand the idea, just the whole concept of therapy. It comes out of a Christian culture. Even if they don't use anything from Christianity, therapy.
Oh, the 12-step program is straight out of the Bible.
Yeah.
It begins with, an awareness that you don't have the power and that you need something bigger than you. the power that is higher than you. I mean, this is square one, and all the steps come right out of that.
And what I find interesting is the whole principle that guides the West from politics to, the idea of democracy and the idea of, don't stand in my way if I want to vote this in. It's the idea that the will is supreme above anything else. It's even supreme above the mind. But the idea of therapy, it is fundamentally against that. It is the idea is you are powerless and you need help. And
well, I think recently, this is when you say, the West, this is more postmodern, because in modernism, we really did have a logical, rational approach to things as there being an order and a right and an intelligent and so on. But as we move into postmodernism, my gosh, rational thought has been replaced by feelings. And so instead of this, and it is appealing, I'll say this too, from a former addict point of view, that it is such a painful, tormenting struggle. And maybe some of those listening who haven't been drug addicts, who've been porn addicts, would know this as well, that it's such a tormenting struggle and so difficult and so easy to give up, that if somebody just tells you it's not your fault, or that there's nothing that can be done, not necessarily that you have the power in yourself, but that nothing can be done, or to take it a step further, that it's good, that it's natural, all a person needs in that situation is an excuse to throw in the towel, because it's so hard to do it, to break free from these things. And there is, yes, the greater power that is needed, the healer, yes, but that healer can't perform his healing and surgery if we're squirming and pulling all over on the table and pushing away his hand with the scalpel. Or you talked about the sun, and its purifying effects. Well, if you keep pulling a blanket over yourself and running into a cave, that sun can't do it. So again, I don't want to fall too much into the monergism that you might see in some Protestant sects, where it's all God doing it. There has to be a cooperation of us, but the starting point is that I can't.
Yeah. Yeah, and you touch upon, if we step back, the idea that in the West, in postmodernism, we have our emotions, and again, emotions here, not in the way that Plato used it, but in the idea of the urges. That's how Plato would describe it.
Impulse.
Yeah, we see all these liberal countries saying, let's legalize everything. If only we can control it and manage it, then it leads to peace. And what I find interesting is most of the moral system in the West is all about the effect that you can produce. And they have research that, for example, the Netherlands are super low crime, super low violence. Right. But you gave the people the ability to do whatever they want, whenever they want it, as long as they follow certain rules, legal rules, convenience for control. They have robbed them of their personal dignity, and they've turned them into rats in a cage that they can control. And this is fundamentally dehumanizing. Sure, it'll lead to low violence, but you're not left over with humans. And in the time of the Church Fathers, the philosophers focused on morality as a way to build up the individual, a way to let that dignity shine forth. So again, it's two very different worlds. And you find people today, they say, oh, it's good because X, Y, and Z. No, not because of the results, but because of what it will do to you. And again, this whole idea of personal dignity, it's nothing more than the soul.
Was it C.S. Lewis, again, you probably being the literary guy here would probably know better, that said freedom is not the ability to do what I want, it's the ability to do what I ought.
Yeah, I don't know if it's C.S. Lewis, but right, to do what is in line with your proper nature. To be able,
what I know I ought, and
right,
in you. And that is true freedom, the ability to do that.
Right, what I should. If I do whatever I want, I say to people, if we let that principle rule for 24 hours, say we're just going to let you do it, there won't be civilization left at the end of the 24 hours. Because people, they're deranged that humans will always choose the good in all circumstances. That's nonsense. Sure, they can choose good, even without God, because that's part of the image of God. But to always choose it as a matter of a course, that's nonsense.
Nobody who's raised a child would believe that nonsense.
Yeah. Look at children.
Not once they turn 2.
Children, when they get upset, they go hit the other children, even the adults.
Yeah, once they've been 2, 3 years old, that's nonsense.
Yeah,
I want reigns supreme.
I saw this great video. It's about, fails among reporters. Things went wrong. So there's this kid standing in front of a fireworks booth, and the reporter goes and asks him, how much for these fireworks? The boy, totally unprovoked, he's like 12 years old. He says, wouldn't you like to know, weather boy? And it's like, so, this idea of sin, it's, it deals with our choices. It changes who we are as individuals, runs throughout that first part of Contra Gentes. He really sets up, here's the problem. Then he goes on to the existence of the rational soul. He starts off genius. He argues for its existence. And these arguments can be used today. And again, this work is an apologetic work. So I like to share a couple of those arguments. I won't get into all of them because I think people should read and reflect.
And save some for this for when we move into on the Incarnation proper. Keep in mind, this is our intro to Incarnation.
Yeah. So the first argument that he gives for the existence of soul, the rational soul, is simply the difference between humanity and irrational creatures. Sure, we have elements in us that are animalian. There's no doubt about that. All the church fathers acknowledge that. And again, this is where I think the Protestants really go Gnostic, where they emphasize the total difference of humanity from the creatures. And I think this is why it leads to such problems with scientists, that, they're looking at humans as non-material, and they are material. A big portion, the body, they forgot that. So when they argue, we're different from animals, then when they talk about like homologous structures between us and the animals, and they combat that, that's going too far. It's one thing to
Florovsky, who said, a body without a soul is a corpse, and a soul without a body is a ghost, and neither one is properly a human.
Yeah. So he gives that first argument, and I find it interesting because a lot of scientists, they deny the uniqueness of humanity. And I find it interesting because if you just sit with them a few minutes and talk about language and intelligence and reasoning, these have no connection to other animals. Animals react, humans reason.
Well, this is actually moving. I have a friend who does scientific apologetics for a living, and he does. He's a biochemist. He was a senior research scientist for Procter & Gamble, and as an apologist, he reads everything that comes out of the journals, and more, the evidence is really stacking up that it's not what we had understood to be a matter of degree, the difference between us and animal, but a difference in kind.
Yeah, oh yeah. And I'll get into one more argument that Athanasius gives, and I have the sections labeled. I think it's important for anyone who reads patristics that they need to understand we don't go by page numbers, but by sections in the works themselves. Those are the universal reference points.
And so those would be conceptual sections, or where they section it out, the original writer?
No, so what happens, the editors of these texts, when they were first published, sectioned them out, and other editors adopted it over time. So as a matter of course, translators incorporate these sections. Now you may see them like as numbers in parentheses at the beginning of a paragraph, or every so many paragraphs, or in like the version that I was reading, which you can find in the Schaff edition of the Church Fathers, the Nicene Fathers. Every section begins a new page. And like if a section ends, it ends at the end of that page. Nothing picks up right after. So Athanasius points out, the body's mortal, and it senses things that are mortal. But the soul contemplates things that are immortal. For example, logic, mathematics, God himself. These things don't die. They're always there no matter what we do. So it follows that the soul itself is immortal. And the fact that the soul is distinct from the body means that its nature is different from the body. So it can behold God, and through that soul, that's how we apprehend God. Because, I mean, it goes back to the argument. They say, well, can you see God? I'm like, no Christian theologian ever made that claim.
Isn't that the most ridiculous concept that in atheism, that in order to provide evidence of a transcendent, non-physical reality, we're going to constrain all of our observation to physical, observable criteria? That's just bizarre.
It's the incoherence of materialism. You really want it to be true, but then you're faced with difficulties, because I don't see logic either. For that matter, I don't even see language. I see representations of it. But all these are abstract realities. They cannot be touched or examined. Even I like the social sciences, because while they rely on observation, the observation is non-sensual. It's related to behaviors and results. We can't actually isolate something and hold it in our hands or touch it. It can only come through generalizations. And they don't even notice that those fields of knowledge are non-materialistic.
Yeah, I mean, unless you boiled it down to synapse and chemical, then you might say, that you could boil it down to material terms, but then there's really nothing to say about it as far as qualitatively. It's merely what is, just like speaking about a rock rolling down a hill when you speak about a human person or society acting in a certain way. It's simply following its physical composition, its material makeup, and doing what that makeup does under those laws of physics in that place and that condition. Just as the same size rock of the same composition put on a different degree of hill and let to roll down, or on another planet with a different mass, would have a different speed. I mean, it really is just kind of bizarre if you tried to speak in material terms and address any of these issues using only materialist language.
Yeah,
such as synapse, chemical, firing, neuron,
And I mean, especially in the fields of neuroscience, the argument is easily made that that's due to response. It doesn't initiate, but it's a response itself. But then that leads to the question, to what? Especially if that thing is not physical. And he gives another great analogy of the immortality of the soul and shows how it's totally immaterial, because it can think about things that will be. Things that will be, by definition, do not exist. So the soul itself is timeless. It's not affected by time. The body is, but the soul reflects on that. But when we think about the future, especially when it comes to judgment making and reasoning, because when we think about the future, that's what happens. We reason about it and we come to a judgment. It's about things that don't exist, and it affects what will exist. That is fundamentally detached from nature. It is timeless. It is eternal.
Wow, that's something. That bare concept is just one of those things that you would sit in for a week.
Oh yeah, and I think with all that, we've pretty much touched on the important points of contragentes. We've talked quite a bit about the philosophical and historical background. I think one thing is left for us to discuss, which is the concept of the logos. Because the logos, yes, it was used in Greek philosophy, but it's very different in which form of Greek philosophy, what its meaning is. The last part of the book, Contragentes, we have now set up the background on the Incarnation, the historical background, the cultural background, the vocabulary, the ideas, such as what sin is, what evil is, that are essential to understanding the book on the Incarnation. He leaves off that book, the very end of that book, he goes into a discussion of the Logos. And I think it's super enlightening for us if we reflect on the Logos himself, where he is laid out, where the idea is laid out and explained in its most recognizable appearance in the Gospel of John. So that's where he leaves off on contra gentes, and immediately it picks up. It's now the incarnation of the Logos in the book on the incarnation. So I think that will be a good place to start.
That's a good transitional point.
Yeah, it's a very good transitional point for the book. So that will be the next video.
Well, thank you, Daniel. This has been really, really interesting for me. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm here for me. So I'm really, really appreciating this.